Hello and welcome to the Condor Cam this afternoon. I'm Charles Eldermeyer, the project leader for the Cornell Labs Bird Cams. And I'm really excited to bring our viewers the opportunity to have a conversation with two people who are closely involved in the California Condor Recovery Project. Molly Astell, a wildlife biologist from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge Complex, and Nadya Seal Faith, conservation and research associate at the Santa Barbara Zoo. During the next hour or so, we're going to be talking with them about condors, the recovery project, and answers to questions that many of you have sent in to us via all the different ways you can send us questions. So thank you to everybody for participating in this Q&A today, and welcome to everybody out there in California. How are you doing today, Molly and Nadia?
Doing great. Yeah, we're doing awesome.
Great. So I think maybe a great place to start in this, because it's such a complex project and there's so many sort of moving pieces to the entire thing. I don't know if one of you might want to start by giving kind of a general overview of what the Condor Recovery Project is and does, and then maybe we can hone in on what role each of you play in that and sort of build out from there into sort of the more nitty gritty.
Right. So yeah, the Condor Recovery Program. I mean, it's kind of an ongoing project. I think we kind of well, I mean, back in the 80s, we kind of had a low point. Being more involved. Before then, we had biologists out there who were observing things, and we noticed that the population was declining and declining. And once it hit that low point of 22 birds in the wild, that's when the decision was made to bring them all into captivity. So at that point, there was essentially no condors in the wild. And so from there, they did a captive breeding program, which was kind of like the next phase in the Condor Recovery Program. And then once we had a few more birds in captivity in the 90s, we could start releasing them again. And it's kind of been, a slow progression of the numbers starting to rise in the wild. And we're really starting to get to that point where we're not so much managing individual birds as the whole population. And that is a great place to be in the Condor Recovery Program.
Well, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
and the zoos and the captive breeding programs have been really integral part in all of that. As Molly mentioned, there was a captive breeding basically solely just for a few years. All the condors were in captivity, and so the zoos have continued to work kind of behind the scenes to help bring that population back up and introduce those birds into the wild to increase the population overall.
Cool. And so you are both in, obviously, those organizations, and what sort of role do each of you play in there? I don't know if you want to start, Molly, and then go on to what Nadia did.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and my job is basically kind of working in the field and doing the management out in the field. And then also a big part of what I do is I also help set up and get these cameras out there in the wild. So, if ever the camera goes down and there's that little note like, hey, we're working on it, that's me going out trying to figure out what's wrong. So
And you've been awesome during that, because I'm often the person who's bugging you, asking why I can't reach a camera, asking why we can't get better data rates, and you've been incredible.
right.
And to people out there listening, we're going to get in, hopefully, we're going to get into detail a little bit more and sort of what goes into setting up these cameras a little bit later in this hour, as well as the big reveal. You guys do know the sex of this chick at this point. We will be letting you guys know that just a little bit later in the hour, too. And so what do you do, Nadia?
Well, the Santa Barbara Zoo has had this fantastic opportunity to be able to be a close partner with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and their California Condor Recovery Program. The Santa Barbara Zoo strongly believes in putting its resources into local conservation programs. And so when we found out that the California condors were basically in our backyard, we wanted to take advantage of that. And so what we've been able to do is just provide field support. We have 2.5
full-time positions dedicated to the California Condor Recovery Program. My position as the conservation associate is actually to help to coordinate our involvement in all of our field programs, which also include things like the Channel Island fox, red-legged frog. But our primary investment has been the California Condor Recovery Program. And so I help to manage that. I also go out in the field, go on nest entries, help with nest management, help track and monitor. But we're basically extra hands that is able to help with this fantastic program.
And so in thinking about how you're no longer managing for individual birds, as you said, but actually starting to get a chance to think of this more as a population or as a species even beyond an individual representing that species. You know, there's the wild population, there's the captive population. How many birds are each of your organizations dealing with, you know, on a normal basis, you know, say within a breeding season or a given year? And how does that compare to the entire population of condors that's out there in California and beyond?
Great. So out in the wild right now in our population, we have 75 birds. I think as of the end of this week, we're going to be releasing 3 more, so we're going to bump up that number a little bit. But that's how many birds that we have just kind of in our population. And of course, there's other populations that other partners help us manage. So up in Big Sur, the Park Service in Ventana have their own population of somewhere around like 70, 80 birds. And then there's another population out in Arizona, and then one down in Baja, Mexico. So there's different populations, but the one that we deal with kind of on a day-to-day basis it's those 75 birds. But in the whole world, as of the beginning of this year, January, there was 463 in the whole world. And I guess I kind of let Nadya tackle the captive side.
And so a little bit more than half of those individuals, that world population, are in the wild, and the rest are in captivity. There are several different captive facilities, and they all have their own component in the Condor Recovery Program. Some act as captive breeding centers, like San Diego, Los Angeles Zoo, the Peregrine Fund World Center for Bird of Prey, the Chapultepec Zoo down in Mexico, as well as the Oregon Zoo up in, well, Oregon. But there are facilities like the Santa Barbara Zoo that have the birds on exhibit as means for either holding them until they can go into those captive breeding programs, holding birds that wouldn't be able to be in the wild due to either behavioral injury and also just being ambassadors for outreach and education. So there's a lot of different components that the captive side helps out with in that respect.
Right, and all these birds are basically coming from that couple of dozen birds who were all in captivity back in the 80s, correct?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
there were the 23 that were in the world, the 22 that got pulled into the wild, that added to the one that was in captivity. And they all come from 3 distinct genetic lineages, and there are 14 genetic founders.
Wow. And so you guys have obviously done an incredible job of managing to grow both those populations, the wild population, the captive population. And, you know, one viewer wrote in via email, her name was Julie. She was wondering, you know, well, what is the survival rate of condor chicks or condors in the wild? So born in the wild, maybe versus captive released. And, you know, is it increasing or decreasing?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of speak to the survival rate of chicks in Southern California, because those are the ones that we've been kind of keeping track of really closely. And the data points that we use for, you know, survival of the chick is going to be nest success. So whether the chick is it has made it to the point where it is officially fledged. Now, when the condor started to nest after the reintroduction in 2001, we noticed that between 2001 and 2006 in Southern California, nest success was roughly 6% to 12%. There was essentially 17 nests. One chick fledged without any intervention. There was a second chick that also fledged, but it required a lot of intervention, which is why we kind of have that difference in percentage. But it was well below the historic rate of 40% and below even Arizona's rate, which is about 36%. Once we initiated the nest guarding program, kind of a twofold program of behavioral analysis and nest management, part of which includes these cameras, nest success jumped up to about 60%. Right now, we're at about 54%, and part of that is because the number of nests have increased over the years. This year, we actually had a record number of nests of 12, which has been pretty awesome to deal with and awesome to see. And we've been able to step back our management a little bit because of that, and we're able to see these nests, kind of flourishing on their own. And again, we're able to do that because we have these cameras that allow us to intervene only when necessary. So I would say that the trend is probably going to be increasing naturally from that initial 6 to 12% as we modify our nest management techniques, partly because the population is growing. One of the biggest reasons that nests have failed in the past that we'd seen is the presence of microtrash, which causes impaction in the chick's GI tract. And what we think we're seeing is that as the population is growing within its habitat range, a lot of those sources of microtrash are maybe being diluted within the range. And so that may not be as much of a problem long-term, which is good for us when it comes to management of these nests, because it means that we can slowly start to extract ourselves from the process and make it so that these birds, which is the ultimate goal, can survive on their own.
I mean, it's really amazing. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
As far as like the different survival rates between like the wild chicks and the ones that are captive, the captive reared chicks have like a little bit of an advantage because they'll be in captivity where they're safe from predators and some of the other threats that the wild chicks have to deal with. And so they're in like a pretty safe spot for the first year and a half of their life. So they have that whole jump on them because we don't release them until they're about a year and a half old. And the wild chicks, they're kind of out there in the wild with a little bit more threats. So they have more to deal with than the captive reared ones. But
well, yeah, it's kind of amazing to imagine these birds who have never been in the wild navigating, finding these cliffside caves, and breeding successfully, which in and of itself is really amazing. But then to think about the work and the effort that goes into setting up cameras or monitoring those nests is pretty incredible as well. I think I have an image here that I'd really love to show if you guys don't mind. And it's a shot looking down, I think across, I don't know, you guys can tell me what this image is, if you can see on your end.
Yeah, so that was actually an image that I took a couple of years ago when we were initially setting up the camera that you see inside the nest. And what you can see is kind of down towards the bottom is a person that's actually in the nest versus somebody up at the top. Joseph's up at the top. Molly's up there as well, making sure everything behind the scenes is getting set up and remotely. But it definitely does, it gives you the scope. And Molly can speak a little bit more towards that.
Yeah, I mean, looking at this, you can see, and even watching the camera, you can see that this terrain is definitely, it's steep out there. And it's also challenging to get some of those bits of equipment out there. Like you can imagine trying to get a solar panel down a cliffside without breaking it's a little bit of a challenge.
I'm going to fade over to a slightly different picture. This is looking out from the Cross Canyon cam, which we have a couple other cool images from, but our viewers are probably at least somewhat familiar with this image because we've zoomed out a little bit to see the cliffside there. But where in relation to that is that solar panel that would be powering the camera over on the other side where the nest is? Is it even in the image?
I don't think it is.
It's just above. So you can kind of see some green bushes right at the top middle of the screen.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, there it is. So the green is just above where those green bushes are. And so, the area needs to be flat in order to set up all of that. And sometimes we need to a very long way.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to have a flat area where we can set up, like the battery that powers it and the solar panel and all of our equipment. And then, because you can't just like set that up on the side of a cliff face, obviously. So then we just have like a really long bit of conduit, kind of connecting it to the camera itself. Yeah, and some of them are definitely longer than others and are a bit more of a challenge.
And it does take a specialized skill set, obviously, to get into the cavity, because in order to do that, you need to get on rope and rappel down and, abide by all those safety protocols. So it does take a specialized skill set in order to set up these cameras, and a bit of will and determination and a lot of perseverance.
Yeah, I got to be out there when I got to help out install a camera maybe 5 years ago, and it was quite the exciting, hot, sweaty, dry ordeal. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into this, but I want to jump back first to a comment that you made, which was, nest success is increasing, which means maybe your interventions need to become less. Hopefully, over time, the species hopefully is able to continue to sort of successfully nest with maybe less intervention, we would hope. But what sort of would be the bigger threats out there? You talked about microtrash. Why do we not see these populations increasing even more greatly due to your intervention efforts?
Right. So one of the major threats for condors out there is lead poisoning. So that's about half of the known causes of deaths that we have are somehow related to lead. And just to be clear about it, so the source of the lead is in ammunition. So if an animal is shot with a lead ammunition, that lead kind of gets spread throughout the carcass, and then a condor or another scavenger comes along, says, "Hey, free meal," and eats it, and then ingests that lead, and then that's where the problem comes in. But it's also important to note that, even though lead is the main problem, that does not mean that hunting is also the problem. Those are two different things. So hunters and ranchers and folks who shoot recreationally, they are also creating a great food source for the condors. That is one of the major things that the condors feed in the wild. The problem is just that contaminant in the ammunition that they use. And so trying to find an alternative to that type of ammunition, that's the main goal.
And there has been there have been attempts through legislation to deal with this issue as well, correct?
Yeah, so so in California, the state has a ban. Well, first they had a ban in the condor zone for lead ammunition in big game hunting, and then the state also has another law on the books that's pretty much going to ban lead in the whole state. But there are also other programs, out in Arizona, they don't have any laws regarding this. And they're able to kind of, work with folks and get that buy-in from all the different stakeholders. And that's another great way to do it. It's not just making a law isn't necessarily the only way we can achieve this goal or the answer. Both approaches kind of have their pros and cons. So, yeah.
And the biggest thing is education and outreach is, utilizing platforms like this to get people to understand that, lead poisoning can be detrimental to not only condors, but all scavengers, and it can really affect wildlife. And it's that boots on the ground effort and allowing people to make the decisions to change based on the knowledge and education that's out there.
That's a really great point, that it doesn't have to be, there's both top down, bottom up, sideways ways of approaching the problem, and working together winds up often getting us farther.
Yeah.
So given that you guys seem to have a really great grasp on, with almost 40 years now of experience, not necessarily you two having 40 years of experience doing this, but within the sort of realm of knowledge about taking care of condors and helping return them to the wild, it's been an extraordinarily long and, by lots of different counts, successful effort. And we had a question from Catherine come in wondering about given that the recovery plan is in its last phase, is there a timeline towards when people think condors would be delisted at some point, and whether there would be provisions sort of after delisting? So it might seem, with only 400 or 500 birds, that this is still way off. But I guess people are wondering, what are the targets that would make it be a reasonable next step, delisting?
Sure. So I think one of the things is we hope this is kind of the last phase, but we don't know for sure. I guess I should just throw that out there. But yeah, so right now the population, we've just kind of got to this good point where we're managing the population and everything. But as far as like the specific delisting criteria, we're kind of, they don't have specific delisting criteria right now, and they're kind of working on that currently. So we hope to have like those as solid numbers kind of by the end of 2019. But basically it would be a population that's certainly like an order of magnitude larger than what we currently have, that can basically sustain itself without any human intervention, which is our goal. We're basically just trying to work ourselves out of a job here. So,
and once the condor is delisted, it's not like, okay, we're done, hands off with us. The Channel Island fox just became delisted, but they're still going to continue monitoring programs for the next 10 years to make sure that there's not a crash, which I'm sure would still be the case with condors as well.
That's a great point. Well, thanks for sort of explaining that, because I think to some people it seems like a very crisp, clear kind of situation, and you guys have been very successful, and everyone lauds the great work done. And everyone's always looking towards when they can even give you a bigger pat on the back for saying, job well done. They're no longer endangered. And I think that's everyone's goal. Everyone's excited about that. And we've been talking sort of broadly about condors as a population, as a species, but for most of our viewers, the single few individuals they've seen on these condor cams, maybe their only time ever overlapping with a condor so far in their life. So the next little part of this, I'd like to just focus in maybe on the Hutton's Bowl area here, and maybe just start with, people are wondering, you guys did this 4-month checkup at 120 days roughly, and one of the things you guys do is check the sex. So do you guys have any information for our viewers about whether we're talking about a boy condor or a girl condor?
Well, we do, in fact. We got the results in, and one result that we got, which is actually kind of exciting, I'm going to build this up a little bit. One result that we got back from the blood that we sent in was actually a relatively low lead level. And that's actually pretty exciting for us to see, especially considering, we have seen chicks with fairly high lead levels in the past. So it was nice to see that this one had a pretty low one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you might notice that I'm wearing a blue shirt, and that is no coincidence because our little darling number 923 is a boy.
That's great.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. We actually had.
You may notice.
I was going to say, let me just share one thing with you. We had Marlene write in on email asking whether it was male or female, and she said that she was comparing it to last year's female chick, and she sees that it behaves very differently, so she guessed that it was a male. And she also said, P.S. As a reading teacher, I incorporate birds into my curriculum. I have second graders who love to check in on the condor cam. So I thought you guys would like that.
Oh yeah, that's great to hear. And you know what? We make our guesses ourselves too. We'll watch cams and we'll try to see, well, is that one male or female? I mean, ultimately they're kind of guesses. Males and females are considered sexually monomorphic, which means that, from outward appearances, they basically look the same. That's the same for chicks as well as adults. Some slightly different features that you can pick up on. Males are slightly bigger. Their cranial structure is a little bit different. They do act slightly different behaviorally, especially when it comes to breeding season. You can imagine that males will act a little bit differently than females during that time. But it is kind of interesting because once you start watching these cameras for a really long time, maybe there are certain subtle behavioral indicators that, just like a little girl or a little boy growing up, a little boy might be a little bit more active than a little girl. Obviously that can change with individuals. But it's interesting that a viewer did pick up on that because sometimes our staff picks up on that as well. Sure. So yeah, definitely interesting that she picked that up, and way to go, Marlene. Also, kudos for getting your second grade class involved. We definitely like to promote conservation towards the next generation, which is something that the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Santa Barbara Zoo are becoming impassioned about. And we've actually created a curriculum for that next generation. It's called Condor Kids. And it's a curriculum that's free to any teacher that wants to incorporate it into their classroom. They just go to condorkids.net if they're interested.
It's a great point. Yeah, we always like to make sure people out there understand that there's some great resources that you guys have developed to let them sort of extend what they're seeing on screen and actually explore it from lots of different angles. Because as cool as it is to see them live in the wild, it's also really abstract, and there's nothing like, you know, drawing out the outline, for example, of a giant condor wing and seeing just how big these animals are.
Yeah.
So we know now that the chick had low lead levels, that it's a male. Was there anything else that came from that? Because that 120-day check is your last time, at least till this bird fledges, interacting with the chick, correct?
That's correct. And basically, you know, we did an overall health check, and the chick was overall healthy. I think we just saw maybe a couple of parasites that we treated in the nest, but that's nothing that's unusual. The chick had about a 7-inch tail, which is really good growth at that time. And the chick was 18 pounds and 11 ounces, which is a little bit bigger than your average Thanksgiving turkey. So overall, the chick looked really well, and getting that confirmation back that their lead level was low, seeing how active the chick is right now on the camera, you know, it's doing everything that behaviorally we expect it to do for a chick at this stage, you know, is great. And then there's the very obvious little wing bling that it got, where one of our nest biologists actually created this handmade tag, and we sewed in a VHF transmitter so that we can track the bird after it fledges. And then eventually that'll get replaced with an adult tag once we're able to trap it at one of our trapping sites during the trapping season.
That must be an amazing feeling to be in the nest with a condor. Now, one question we have gotten that I thought I'd sort of bounce to you guys, since you are the experts, of course. We're getting lots of questions about when or whether this bird has fledged. So we've watched on this cross canyon cam in a way that we've never been able to do over the last few years. We've just noticed the last few years that they've disappeared from the little cave where they had hatched, or the ledge. So knowing that you've maybe seen this bird make some flights, we've certainly seen it make some flights along the cliff sides here, generally short. What's your opinion on whether or not this bird has fledged, or what might, in your eyes, it doesn't have to be the Fish and Wildlife or Santa Barbara, you know, definition necessarily, but what sorts of things would you be looking for to confirm that you would consider this bird fledged?
Right. So, I mean, fledging is definitely kind of a process, and it's a little bit of a gray area of whether or not you're going to call it fledged. I think so for purposes of our documentation, we consider the bird fledged when it can fly to a spot where it couldn't otherwise walk to. So that's kind of how we define it. And we were just kind of debating yesterday and today of whether or not, like, has it really fledged? In my own personal opinion, I think it's there. I think it made a flight that was pretty convincing for me. But again, it's a process. You know, it's kind of like when a child learns how to walk. It's not like they just stand up and walk. It's a process.
So you guys are in agreement that given what you've seen, you'd probably lean toward this bird having achieved that fledged status. Putting you on the spot.
I mean, it's definitely to the point where it can sustain itself, you know, in flight. What's going to be really exciting to see is how quickly, and what we have seen is how quickly these birds start making these much longer flights. Mm-hmm. In 2016, the chick 846 fledged out of this cavity. And, you know, unfortunately, we didn't have the availability of this cross canyon camera, so we didn't see kind of the subtle lead ups to that point. But very quickly after we had considered her fledged, we were seeing her make, you know, 15, 20-minute flights, you know, very high in the air. And I think that is going to be, you know, really indicative, obviously, of the bird fledging. And I think that 923 is definitely showing that he is capable of that sustained flight in a very short matter of time.
That is so exciting. Well, I think everyone, after watching for the last few years, is just, we had our first bird make it, our first cam bird make it last year. To be able to have this cross canyon view, we've gotten nothing but great feedback from viewers, especially on Twitter, who are just astounded by the view that they're seeing. And it really opens up a different world from that cavity where, that's all we've been able to see in past years. And you guys are the ones that get to see this cool cross canyon stuff usually. But one thing we did see yesterday, and I don't know if you guys saw this clip, but Kazoo on Twitter, Kazoo, that's a good name, 2 Z's, 2 O's, asked, would the golden eagle who visited the cam yesterday consider our chick a prey item? And it's a really important question. We've read through the birds of North America, read some accounts, but we don't know if you guys have sort of more regional information that might be sort of more specific to golden eagles and California condors in Southern California.
Sure. So golden eagles, they are a bit of a threat to condor chicks, especially right around that age when they're just fledging. I don't necessarily know that they consider it directly a prey item. I think the thought is that a lot of these younger golden eagles kind of like they're learning how to hunt. And so they're kind of in that mode of like learning, okay, like this is how I do it. And it's not necessarily, if a golden eagle does attack a condor, it's not necessarily because it is hungry and it wants to eat that. It's just kind of learning it's learning that hunting behavior. So yeah.
That makes sense. It's almost
yeah,
like
and they're not.
Go ahead.
Oh, and they're not direct competitors for food. I mean, golden eagles are hunters, condors are scavengers. However, they do overlap in the habitat that they nest in. And so we do have golden eagles nesting very near, condor nests, which is why when juvenile golden eagles are coming up and learning how to, quote unquote, stretch their wings or stretch their talons, we do see these types of interactions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it reminds me of like, if anyone's ever been around a kitten or a puppy or any other animal when it's young, just learning what all of its body parts do. You could imagine a young golden eagle kind of doing the same thing. And sort of, again, thinking about that young versus old theme, Linda wrote in on email, we've had a lot of great opportunities to see this chick right next to an adult in like beautiful sunlight, not even within sort of the kind of dingier light of the cave. And she's wondering, when will the condor chicks, neck and head and bill turn the color of the adults? Because it's such that the adults' heads are so beautiful. How long is it going to take them?
So they usually start to get that adult coloration right around 4 to 5 years. But one of the other interesting things is like, obviously you have the head coloration, which is a pretty obvious change, but their eyes also change colors at about 2 years or so. They go from that brownish color to a red color. And one other kind of interesting note on coloration that I think it's interesting, is that their diet also affects what colors their head is. So if you have some condors who tend to feed just on cattle and they tend to have more of a pink head, but some of the other ones who forage on more of the different wild species have those brighter oranges and yellows and purples and all those beautiful colors. So that's always kind of interesting to see too.
And it does coincide with sexual maturity. Once all those black feathers are gone and once those bright colors can come up, it's typically around the time that they are able to nest and be in pairs and start reproductive.
Wow, that is just an interesting thing about the colors being affected by what they're eating. We know in some birds their feather plumage, for example, can change based upon the different carotenes and things that are in, let's say the fruits that they're eating. But is that like a long-term change, or can just like as their diet changes, the colors in their head change? Is that something that's known?
Yeah, I think some of our colleagues at one of the zoos they noticed they had gotten in some different species for their captive birds to feed on. And they noticed the color changed, and some of those birds kind of still retain those different brighter colors. So it sticks around, although it definitely kind of fades away if they just go back to eating one particular food source after that.
Oh, that's really neat. Makes me wonder if, what kind of heads adults prefer when they're looking for a mate too.
Yeah,
be an interesting thing to look at. So we've been talking about this cross canyon cam and how awesome it is. And obviously we've been watching these inside the nest cams. We flashed up a couple images earlier. What do you think, if you had to describe to somebody what it takes to put up some of these cameras? I have a picture here of a crew of people who are getting ready to go out to the field with a bunch of gear up and down those slopes. I've got, another picture here of some people that look like they should be roped in, maybe. It looks like a nice little ledge behind them.
And that's considered relatively flat.
I've even got, some people actually working here. You guys might recognize. And with our actual cross canyon cam, a look at what the masterpiece of construction that actually houses our cross canyon cam. And so I wondered if you guys could maybe spend a couple minutes telling us a little bit about what it takes to get some of this equipment up and running.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely a process. It's a pretty big challenge to get that all set up out there. So I think for the cross canyon cam, I was kind of doing a little bit of math. And there's a lot of different equipment that we have to carry down there, like the solar panel is one of the really big bulky ones. We also have these really large batteries that we bring out, that this one was about like 50, 60 pounds, I think. And so I took the battery, and I think I calculated that with the battery and all my water, it was probably like 75, 80 pound pack. So I think maybe next time somebody else can take the battery and I'll take something else. Although no matter what you have, there's some challenge associated with it. Trying to get that solar panel kind of through the different brush and all the trees in the ways, you just kind of get stuck. You have to kind of coordinate your way around it and then get down the rope and everything. But yeah, and you can see in the picture, it takes a whole team to get everything out there.
Our mule team,
yes.
How many people How many people usually work together to get one of these established?
Usually, so for the setup process, it's usually me and maybe another person who kind of like get all the gear assembled and made and everything. And then we definitely rely on a whole crew to do it. I think if we have like 6 people, that's awesome, but sometimes we do it with less. We had a camera this year where me and another individual who works with the Santa Barbara Zoo, we just took 2 trips down there ourselves to do it over 2 days. So sometimes it's fewer people, but you just make it work. You take more trips. So
that's a good point. Yeah, and it's not like the country is bad for walking through. In the case of this cross canyon cam, one thing that's different compared to all the other cams that we've been looking at for the last couple years is this one is nowhere near these condors, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so if we look,
it's all the way across the canyon.
Yeah, and so if we look at like this camera here that you sent along a picture to, is there anything different that you have to be keeping in mind when you are installing one of these cameras into a nest cavity with these condors?
Sure, yeah. So one of the things maybe some of the watchers have noticed is that sometimes the condors can get the lens a little bit dirty. So you kind of have to be strategic about where you put it. If you can put it up, that's definitely better. But sometimes, depending on the shape of the cavity, you kind of just have to go with what you've got. But ideally, you put it higher up for sure.
And when they were first installing these cameras back in 2012, they initially put housing on them to kind of blend them in. They had housing that kind of made it look like a rock. And we kind of just found that the condors would go and check them out either way. And so, by just mounting them like this, it didn't really change their behavior, their nesting behavior, their outcomes really at all. They definitely still find the conduit interesting to, mandibulate. That's their form of being sensory to the world. They'll definitely, you've seen them poke their, little beaks up and check it out. But yeah.
Then, as far as lessons learned with the cameras, so this was actually in one of 374's nests. We had a camera in one of his previous nests, and it was not secured tightly down to the ground or the wall. So one of the last images I saw on that camera was the chick pulling the conduit, and then the video cut. We didn't see anything else. So we've learned to secure them better.
Yeah, as we've seen, I think in multiple years, they've been able to sort of drag a piece of conduit this way, but thankfully never dislodged. I remember I think in the Coford's Ridge cavity, they were able to pull it right sort of in front of the view of the camera, which I think was probably very satisfying to them.
Sure.
So given that
our camera side checks.
Yeah. So given that this is your first kind of cross-canyon surveillance cam for these guys, what do you think the value of having a camera like this for you, monitoring these birds? What kinds of things does this camera offer you the opportunity to learn?
Well, I think that there has been a little bit of a gap in, what we've been able to see happen to the chick, before it's fledged and then afterwards. The chick is really vulnerable, like any other chick that's fledging during that time, to different outside threats. Golden eagles could be one of them. Other terrestrial predators could be a factor. There's just been a lot of instances where, well, not a lot, but when chicks don't survive after fledging, we can take a good guess as to what may have happened. But what we've been relying on are in-field observations. And because we can't have somebody out there 24/7, sometimes something may happen to the chick, and based on a necropsy or based on, where the chick ended up, just certain elements, we've kind of this puzzle of what may have happened. And so what we can utilize with this cross canyon camera is we can, one, answer that big question. What can happen? What does this chick go through? Where does it go? What behaviors could make it vulnerable to what threats? What are the natural threats that this condor chick may be facing in the wild during this process? It also allows us to answer some really great behavioral and kind of natural history questions. We have a lot of information on that nesting phase for when the parents actually lay the egg to when the chick actually fledges. But we are starting to develop our long-term database in how the parents interact with the chick during this time, what the chick is actually doing to kind of get itself to the point where it's flying around. And so it's kind of behavioral, or really, really beneficial in both a natural history study of the species, as well as answering certain management questions that we haven't fully realized and we're hoping to realize now.
I would be so excited if I was in your shoes, and I can tell from your voice that it's an exciting set of information for you guys to get to interact with outside of those just like little blips that you get from your volunteer observers. And it's a joy, I think, that's been shared by a lot of our viewers. So thank you for sharing sort of a more kind of, rather than just a gushing take on it, which is kind of what we get a lot. Oh, this camera's great. There's some real purpose behind it, because it takes a lot of work to get a camera like this up and running. It's great to know that it's not just for us to be able to watch. It's serving a really good purpose in furthering the conservation of this really poorly known period in these young birds' lives. And that's really neat. So for the next 15 or so minutes, I've got that'll take us up to an hour. It's not that I want to cut it short. That'll take us right up to about 1 hour of talking if you're starting to get a little thirsty. We've gotten a variety of questions from people sort of on a variety of topics. And I'm just going to start working through them and see where it leads us, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, sounds great.
Great. So one question involves food. You say that they're scavengers. People want to know what kind of food these birds are eating. And also, one viewer asked, Penny was her name, what competition for food is there for condors, and will there be enough food to sustain them?
Sure. So for the wild birds out there, a lot of what we see them foraging on is cattle is a major one, also deer, sometimes elk, sometimes they will scavenge some of the smaller rodents too, ground squirrels. I think we've seen a few of them. We've seen a cat once, so it's kind of pretty much anything that is dead that's out there is a potential food source for them. I imagine if it was another dead condor, that might be the only thing that they wouldn't eat. But yeah, and so the area that the condors kind of range on, that's about 18,000 square miles. It's a huge area. I don't think that we don't have any concern about them not having enough food. There is enough food on the landscape. As far as competition, I don't know that there's really a lot of competition for them. Like if they're at a carcass and there's another bird, like other birds that might be there would be like ravens, maybe a turkey vulture, every once in a rare while, a golden eagle. And since they're the largest land bird in North America, they can pretty much push all those other birds around. The only exception being, I know I've seen condors at a feeding site where there was one golden eagle and it was on top and it was kind of getting its fill. And then there was about a dozen condors just standing there because they didn't want to push him. Yeah. Even though there was way more of them, they're just like, you know what, you just take your time and then we'll run in. But yeah, otherwise I don't think they're really that limited by food source. Luckily, that's not our problem.
That's great. And when it comes to the adults foraging and bringing back food for the chicks, so the chick's still getting fed right now, obviously, how much would they be feeding a chick in a feeding? Is there some sort of like general idea? And then how does that relate to, I mean, obviously if they get fed more, they grow more, but how quickly does a chick grow across its lifetime until it fledges, I guess? I think you guys sent along a graphic about this too.
Yeah, we actually compiled some average chick weights from our nest entry, and we found that they grow fairly steadily. Males are a little bit bigger than females on average during the growth period. But as you can see at the 120-day check, they're about 17, 18 pounds on average. So you can kind of see that steady growth from about 4 to 5 pounds at 30 days, 10 to 11 pounds at 60 days, 14, 15 pounds at 90 days. And then, as we said, this chick actually just weighed in at 18 pounds, 11 ounces. So, almost 19 pounds. He's a big boy. He's doing great. But it is fairly steady. And what we see is the parents kind of correlate the need for them to stay in the nest with the chick with the need for them to go out and forage. So as the chick is getting bigger, it doesn't necessarily need its parent around as much for thermoregulation or necessarily protection again as it gets bigger. It becomes less vulnerable to certain predators or threats. But on the flip side, the parents need to spend more time foraging because they do need to bring back a little bit more food to sustain that bigger chick. But again, on the flip side, condors have an organ called a crop that's part of their GI tract that can store food, and so that they can feed the chick more food that they've been able to forage, and the chick will be able to store that food in its crop. You guys have probably seen, just this big protrusion on its chest level that grows a lot after a feeding. That's its crop, and so the chick can store that food while the adult goes and forages more over time. An adult condor can eat up to 20-25% of its body weight in a single meal, so it can take in up to 4 to 5 pounds of food at a time, and that can sustain not only itself but its chick. But we do see the parents kind of going back and forth, spending less time at the nest later on. However, during this time when the chick is out, we do see the parents kind of sticking around the chick, making sure that it's okay. So there is a lot of play going on. But
one of the things I would point out is like they sometimes, so we had a female whose mate passed away, but at the time she had a chick that was, it was fairly well along. We thought that, she probably can support this chick until it fledges and it's on its own, or, well, she's still helping feed the chick after that point, of course. But we decided, okay, we're going to make it a little easy on her, and we're going to put out a carcass just like a couple miles from her nest site so that she has a really easy food source right there. And so we did that, and every day she would get up, and instead she would go, 40, 50 miles the other direction to feed in the place that she wanted to feed on what she wanted to eat. And then she would come back. So they definitely don't need us to help them on that. They can do it on their own.
That's amazing. And it just goes to show you can always think you're helping and you can make a logical plan of action, but wild animals are going to do what wild animals are going to do. And that's like the first lesson of being a wildlife biologist, probably.
Yep.
We had I think an interesting question from a student who wrote in over email named Aiden. He wondered whether condors recognized each other after they're adults and maybe haven't seen each other in a few years. And is there any evidence that they have sort of long-term memories of other individuals that you've seen take place?
I'm trying to think if I have any evidence of that.
That's kind of an interesting question. The one that comes to mind is 192 and 21, which is just kind of, that's actually more of an interesting one because 192 was the offspring of 21, naturally raised, and she was released in Central California. 21 was released down in Southern California, and she actually made her way down, and they actually ended up pairing up. Now, whether that's recognition or mate selection is who can say, but we do know that condors, or we suspect that condors recognize territories, and so the recognition processes are there. We just released a Condor 20 AC4. After 30 years in captivity, he actually went back and is currently nesting in what we believe to be his natal territory, the area that he most likely fledged from. And speculation, potentially even the same cavity, maybe. We don't know, but there was definitely that recognition. He flew pretty much to the area that he was known to have been in before his before his stint in captivity.
I remember reading that in the paper, and it almost, not quite bringing tears to my eyes, but just like, how cool is it upon being released, this guy just remembered where he wanted to go. I don't know. I really liked that story. And it gets to the question as well, like, how old do these condors live to be?
That's a really good question. We'd like to know that too, actually. The truth is that not enough condors have died of natural causes in the wild for us to really know what their lifespan is. They're the oldest condor that we have in the program. His name is Topa Topa. I believe he's 53, 52, right there. And he's still actively breeding. He produced at least 2 eggs this year. So, to have a bird like that, could keep going. We think probably around 60 years is about the case. I think that there's been an Andean condor recorded at 70 years old. These guys are definitely long-term survivalists, but again, we just haven't seen enough natural causes in the wild to be able to give that a number for the population, the current population.
What a cool thing to not even know. How old can these birds live?
Yeah.
It really gets to the sort of again the success that you guys have been able to build out of what really is still, for all we know, not that well known a creature. That lives in places where people really haven't ever spent a lot of time. So there's not like a rich even cultural history that would really give us all these little fine details that we might want to know for management or helping their populations grow. One viewer wrote in from Twitter, I know many bird species can be very intelligent. How do these guys rate, and do they know you were trying to help them versus being a threat? What is it like being around condors?
Right. So I think one of my favorite things is one of our colleagues used to say they're basically like the chimpanzees of the bird world. So, they're very socially complex, and they're pretty intelligent birds. I just recently heard from one of our colleagues down in Baja. She had an interesting story where, just to kind of set up the situation, they have a flight pen down there, which is basically like a really big cage with the birds in it. And they had, there was a carcass inside of the flight pen for the captive birds to feed on. And then there was also a carcass outside where all the wild birds were feeding. And so there was a younger wild chick out there, and being kind of like a young chick, it wasn't really high in the pecking order, so it wasn't really getting in there to get food. And so this captive bird came down from his perch, dragged the carcass over to the edge of the cage, and then went back up. And then the wild chick that wasn't able to feed at the feeding site came over and started eating, and got a big full crop of food. And then once he was full, he kind of went away. And that captive bird came back down, walked over to the carcass, and dragged it back to the center, which I thought was really interesting behavior.
Wow.
Just kind of being able to recognize that, like, that bird isn't feeding, and also have that kind of, I don't know if you want to say empathy, but
wherewithal.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And it also gets to that, there's lots of theories about long-term collaboration or partnership building among animals, and what strategies wind up being stable and best for both parties. And it sort of speaks to that idea, if they do remember each other, that kind of tit for tat sort of relationship, maybe somewhere down the line, that bird that was inside the cage, the flight cage, if it runs into that bird that was outside the flight cage, maybe could curry some favor with him. Who knows? It's kind of an interesting thought.
And it's really great because we're able to see these more socially complex behaviors as the population grows and becomes more stable. When you have a small population, it's really hard to see those dynamics because those individuals just simply can't create that complex social network. And now that our population is bigger, we're starting to see and learn new things about these birds, and it's just been amazing to see.
That's great. So we have about 3 minutes left. I've got one question maybe you could try and hit, and then we'll sort of go out on any last thoughts from you guys. Somebody wrote in via Twitter, what can I do to help condors or their conservation? And I thought this would be a nice question to end on today. So what if if you live in California, or if you don't live in California even, are there some things that people can do that would make a difference for condors and conservation?
Sure. I think one of the big things that people, especially in California or areas where condors are found, can do is just kind of, being aware that microtrash is one of our issue. Pick up trash, and not just the big stuff, but like all the little stuff, because that's certainly in the past it was a big issue where the chicks would ingest microtrash and it would stunt their growth and it would cause nest failure. So microtrash is a big one. Also, just kind of being aware and communicating with others, especially if there's anyone who shoots recreationally, just kind of letting them know about lead as a contaminant, and some of the alternatives to lead ammunition that are out there.
And then also supporting programs that do work with the Condor Recovery team. So, there's a friends group, Friends of the California Condor Wild and Free. They work directly with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's also all the captive institutions that are either working with cities or they're nonprofits, and they usually will accept donations that can contribute directly towards condor conservation.
That's great. And so each of both the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Santa Barbara Zoo have websites where people could go to learn more about condors as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And, if you want updates on what's happening now with the southern population, as well as, the other populations, the Facebook page, the Condor Cave, is also a really good resource for information.
Awesome. Well, we'll be sure to follow up with some posts on Twitter, to the news feed underneath the cam, and a Facebook post, just making sure we put all those links for anybody that wants to follow up later to learn more about condors. But I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you very much to Molly and Nadya for taking the time out of their day to help all of us learn a little bit more about the Condor Project and the hard work that goes into keeping this population growing. And thank you guys very much for speaking with us today.
Our pleasure. Thank you to everyone that tuned in today and who tunes into the Condor Cam regularly.
Awesome. Well, you guys have a great day. Go out and save some more condors, and we'll hopefully talk again soon. Take care.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye-bye.